Until 1978, the building you are in was the site of the J.C. Lohr & Sons Oyster House. When this film was made in the 1950s, the company was a partnership between two brothers, Dick and Joseph C. Lohr, Jr. These men had joined their father in the business in the 1920s. J.C. Lohr Sr. had started the business in 1888 after coming to Solomon's from New Jersey. The Lohrs packed Patuxent River oysters, and their products were consumed by people who lived as far west as Ohio and Wisconsin. The Lohrs got their oysters in many ways. In the Patuxent River, they owned several hundred acres of oyster beds, which they planted each year with small seed oysters. When these oysters reached market size, normally about 2 years, they were dredged up by company-owned workboats. They also bought oysters from the many independent watermen who used shaft tongs to harvest oysters from public beds in the Patuxent River. Other oystermen, like Ike and Joe Dodson, used patent tongs to harvest oysters in deep water. In 1950, patent tongs were not powered by hydraulics as they are today. They were worked manually or with a gas-powered winch. These watermen sold their oysters to buy boats, large boats which anchored near the beds to buy the daily catch. The Lohrs owned 2 such boats and contracted others to buy oysters on the eastern shore. The Lohrs buy boats, the William B. Tennyson, now in the museum's collection, and the Sidney R. Riggin, brought the oysters into Solomon's Harbor to dock behind this oyster house. There, the oysters were unloaded, 1 bushel at a time. Each bushel was counted and hoisted to a man who stood on the roof of the building. He then dumped the oysters through an opening in the roof into the receiving room below. In the receiving room, other workers shoveled the oysters into wire baskets and wheeled them to the shucking room. Here, at cement tables, shuckers worked, opening oysters one by one. Speed was important, as shuckers were paid for each gallon of oysters they shucked. In 1950, they were paid $1 per gallon. A fast shucker could produce about 2 gallons an hour. In addition to speed, shuckers had to take care not to cut the oyster, causing it to lose its fluid and shape. Often the shuckers sang spirituals and gospel songs to lift their spirits and to make the work seem to go faster. The shuckers let the shells fall to the floor, and other workers shoveled them into wheelbarrows. The shells were then taken and dumped onto the huge pile that accumulated during the season. Throughout the day, more oysters were unloaded on the dock behind the oyster house, and workers continued to open the oysters one by one. As they removed the oysters from their shells, they sorted them into 2 buckets, one for large oysters and the other for small ones. When their buckets were full, shuckers took them to the window separating the shucking room from the packing room. Here, the oysters were dumped into a skimmer and rinsed to remove shell and grit. The rinsed oysters were skimmed into a gallon measure, and the shuckers were credited for as many gallons as they had shucked. Then the oysters were agitated with forced air and water in a blow tank to cleanse them again. They were dumped from blow tank to another skimmer, then packed into cans. The cans were packed into wooden shipping barrels, which held 20-gallon cans. Flaked ice made at the oyster house was shoveled over the cans to keep them fresh during shipment. Dolores also packed pint cans which were capped by machine. These were packed into wooden barrels for shipment also. Each barrel held 160 pint cans. At the end of each working day, the shucking and packing rooms were scrubbed down, and the shuckers' buckets were sanitized in the steamer. Joseph Lord Jr. inspected them before and after steaming. The barrels of Patuxent River oysters were labeled, hoisted onto a truck, and transported to Washington, Baltimore, and points beyond.